Okay, I suggest we get started, and I'm sure more people will come in as we go. Um, Welcome, everybody. It's very nice to have you here. My name is Dina Lupin. I am the Deputy Director of the Global Network for Human Rights and the Environment. We are extremely excited to host this very important book launch today. And we are particularly thrilled to have Kathleen and Tom and Anna here to talk about the book and to screen the film. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation we have today. I'm going to briefly introduce Tom and Kathleen, and then hand over to them to tell us about the book and to screen the film. And then Anna is going to start a conversation, pose some questions, and we can talk about the book and the film a little bit. And at that point, I'll invite everyone to also join in and participate, to raise questions. In the meantime, you're also welcome to put questions in the chat, and we'll keep an eye on those. So, as I said, we're very excited to have Kathleen and Tom here. Kathleen Moore is a distinguished professor of philosophy emerita at Oregon State University. She's written extensively about the moral urgency of climate action, and she's a co-editor of Moral Ground, Ethical Action for a Planet in Peril. She's the co-editor with Tom of this book, Bearing Witness, and she's the screenwriter for the film that we're going to see today as well. Tom is the Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at North Seattle College and the founder of Environment and Human Rights Advisory. His work brings human rights norms to bear on environmental issues, especially in relation to the climate crisis. He's got a long history with the GNHRE. In 2015, he served on the drafting group for the GNHRE's International Declaration on Human Rights and Climate Change, and he co-organized the 2018 Permanent People's Tribunal session on human rights, fracking, and climate change. With Kathleen, he edited this book, and he also wrote Youth Climate Courts, How You Can Host a Human Rights Trial for People and Planet, which has just recently come out with Routledge. We are very excited to have you here. We're also very excited to have Anna here, who was the founder of the GNHRE, and it's always wonderful to have her back and involved in events that we host. And she has also played a critical role in the People's Tribunal and in, I think, getting this book into action too. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from all of you. I'm really looking forward to this launch. So I'm going to hand over to you, Kathleen.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's so important to be gathered here with you at this hinge point in history. It's a year when we are watching the life-sustaining systems of the earth begin to fray and fall apart. And it's a year in which we're participating in the greatest, the wildest, the fastest exercise of cultural reinvention the world has ever seen. This week, more than 25,000 people are gathered at the climate talks in Glasgow, including maybe some of the people who are listening today, to address what's not only a global environmental catastrophe, but a global crisis of justice. Around the world, the effects of outer control, warming, shimmer with undeserved suffering. It's not going to be easy to turn this heavy, cranking wheel of history, but this is the work ahead of us. You know this. I know it's not going to be easy. I have to tell you, some years ago, I was in Missoula for a session of the Society for Environmental Journalists. I'd been listening to a representative of the American Petroleum Institute. That's the lead lobbying arm of the oil and gas industry. He was a huge guy, shaved head, black overcoat, huge feet. And it was the time of the Deep Horizon gusher. He was speaking in defense of what he called the unfortunate event that occurred. And as it happened after the meeting, I found myself walking side by side with that very man. So I said, asking a question that might not have been as innocent as I hoped that it sounded, I said, "Do you have children?" He didn't take the bait. He stopped walking. He loomed over me. He put his finger in my face and he said, "Don't you ever, 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 ever underestimate the power of the fossil fuel industry." I took that to heart. Ending the hegemony of the largest industry on earth, on track to bring in revenues of $21 trillion this year, is a challenge not ever, ever, ever to be underestimated. And it's going to take every possible strategy, which is why we are here. Because today we'd like to introduce you to a new book and a film that we offer what we believe is a powerful, maybe transformative foundation for global action, the human rights case against climate change. So we will talk about taking climate change to an international human rights court of justice. Our question has been, how might global action against climate change be empowered if the world understood that the actions of the transnational oil and gas corporations and their government accomplices are not environmental issues only, rather they are, in addition, serious and widespread violations of fundamental human rights, starting with the rights to health, clean water, and indigenous sovereignty, and leading always and almost inexorably to violations of political rights, such as the freedom of expression and the freedom of assembly. That was our question. Our hypothesis, I should say our hope, is that when scientific studies and political horse trading alone fail to stall climate catastrophe, moral outrage at its injustice, expressed through human rights courts, can inspire effective and important action. So we believe that action in international courts can globally affirm that when climate change and the radical extraction techniques that it fuels directly threaten universal human rights to life, liberty, or security of person, then they breach the global moral consensus about the limits of human decency. Those are, of course, the broadly and deeply accepted moral norms encoded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other human rights instruments. So that was our hypothesis, and this was our test. In 2014, a small group of human rights scholars began the year-long process of petitioning the Permanent Peoples Tribunal to hold a special session on human rights, fracking, and climate change. The petitioners were our own Anna Grear, the founder of the Global Network for the Study of Human Rights and the Environment, Tom Kerns, the co-drafter with Anna and others of the International Declaration on Human Rights and Climate Change, and Damien Short, the director of the Human Rights Consortium at the University of London. They chose the Permanent Peoples Tribunal, which is an international civil society human rights court based in Rome. That tribunal had at that point already convened more than 40 sessions investigating state and non-state human rights violations in Latin America, Afghanistan, Bhopal, Chernobyl, and many, many more. They agreed to take on fracking and climate change. That was going to be the first, and so far it's the only such case in history. So in 2018, the week-long session took place. The tribunal decided to conduct the full proceedings on Zoom. Imagine that, because that would make them accessible to everybody on Earth and have no or very minimal carbon and dollar costs of travel. Zoom donated the software in support of this project, and the Spring Creek Project at Oregon State University stepped up to virtually host the proceedings. They provided the platform, the training, and the management. So we offer our huge gratitude and admiration to Spring Creek's leadership, Carly DeTaro, Shelley Stonebrook, Emily Grubby, who beamed the tribunal to the judges who were in their home courts in Spain, South America, Australia, Ecuador, Mexico, the United Kingdom, and Italy. A truly international panel of judges assembled in the way we are assembled today. So during that week, the tribunal heard testimony recorded by eyewitnesses in pretrial hearings. They heard scientific testimony and arguments from legal experts, law professors like John Knox, Mary Wood, and Anna Grear. They heard from moral thought leaders who had formidable stakes in the Earth's future and in climate outcomes. People like Winona LaDuke, who was the Ojibwe leader of Honor the Earth, and Jacqueline Patterson, who is the director of the NAACP's environmental justice programs, and Robin Brunin, who spoke for the Inuit peoples who are being forced from their land by ferocious storms and the disintegration and the collapse of sea ice. In a 101-page document, the 10 judges of the Permanent Peoples Tribunal issued their advisory opinion. It's a detailed and evidence-based document, an evidence-based denunciation, a damnation of transnational oil and gas industry and government treachery. I'll quote, "Government authorities, in collusion with powerful corporate violators, have betrayed the people, and in doing so, have made a mockery of democracy, the rule of law, and the rights of peoples to determine their own destiny and that of the planet." End quote. They went on to say that fossil fuel mining and its local and global consequences are unjust, a massive violation of human rights norms embedded in international agreements that are as close to a moral consensus as this world is likely ever to see. They went on. These violations are rooted in systemic racism and colonialism, by which the worst consequences fall on those people who are least at fault: people of color, people in low-lying and developing nations, indigenous peoples north and south, children, and future generations. So this opinion offers what we believe is a powerful and a transformative model for how the world might might take advantage of and use international human rights standards to, as the New York District Attorney Letitia James said, to stand up to the powerful on behalf of the vulnerable. So the book, we're pleased to present today our new book. Can you see it? Bearing Witness, The Human Rights Case Against Fracking and Climate Change, published by Oregon State University Press and edited by Tom Kerns and Kathleen Dean Moore. Ma'am. It tells a story about this landmark case. It tells the whole story through carefully curated court documents, including these heartbreaking and infuriating testimonies from eyewitnesses, through foundational legal and moral arguments, and through the tribunal's advisory opinion. We believe it is both useful and inspiring. David Boyd, who's the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, wrote about the book. Bearing Witness is a devastating indictment of the controversial practice of fracking for oil and gas, and more broadly, the legal responsibility of coal, oil, and gas corporations for polluting the planet with vast volumes of greenhouse gases. In addition to the book, we've produced a 40-minute film called Bedrock Rights, a new foundation for global action against climate change. It's available free online for anybody who wants to show it. Anybody who wants to show it in their classes or their meetings or their activist groups or coffee shops or church basements or company picnics or family reunions, the Thanksgiving dinner, football halftime show. Whenever you can find a place to show this film, please, please do. The film was created by the same Spring Creek Project, and it offers assistance. The project offers assistance to anybody who'd like to screen the film. So today, we're going to show you a 20-minute segment of that film. Then we're going to reassemble for a conversation with Anna and Tom and myself. And we're very eager to hear your questions and comments. What we want to do, we're very keen to have a conversation with people who are actively exploring new ideas and new strategies to impose legal and moral restraints on a fossil fuel development that threatens to wreck the world. And we are very keen to have a conversation with people who are looking for new ideas and new strategies to compel the governments to take immediate action. So, Dina, if you could figure out how we could show that film, we'll do that, and then we'll be back to you.
You are literally like fighting for my home. So thank you. I'd like to talk more, but I think I'm going to start crying pretty soon. So thank you. This is the area that we've been in for many, many years, right? And for them to come in and tear it up for temporary profit really does suck. It's a big bummer, especially when they don't see us. Because what happens with a lot of this is all the papers that are signed, it's out of sight, out of mind. They don't see us. They don't see that we have to breathe in these gases, or we have to deal with these safety violations that happen out there. We as residents have to deal with this 24/7 because this activity takes place 24/7. It's not an 8 to 5 Monday through Friday job. And I think people need to know that just these stresses that we go through every day shouldn't be there. And these stresses are new. So thank you. I really thank all of you.
We understand that climate change poses a grave and growing danger to the future. What we are now also coming to understand is that the climate crisis is the greatest threat to human rights the world has ever seen. Right to life, health, and security of person are being violated. Not just will be violated, but already are massively violated all around the world. Governments, the very institutions charged with protecting their citizens' rights, are not only failing spectacularly to meet that responsibility, but are deeply complicit in those violations. It's hard to know where to turn. So I was paying attention when my colleagues told me that they were calling for a special session of an international human rights tribunal to hear a rights-based case against fracking and climate change. The tribunal would bypass state and local authorities and appeal directly to universal standards of human decency. The organization I head, the Spring Creek Project at Oregon State University, stepped in to help stage the tribunal, bringing together the international panel of judges, the eyewitness testimony from people on the front lines of fracking, and the arguments of human rights attorneys and moral thought leaders from around the world. In 2018, we live streamed the tribunal, a global first, with the intent to involve as many voices as possible, as equitably as possible, rich and poor, near and remote. After a long deliberation, the tribunal has issued its ruling. It reaches damning conclusions about the human rights violations of oil and gas companies, undeterred, in fact, enabled by governments. The tribunal's ruling offers powerful, transformative, and desperately needed new tools to help rein in governments and corporations that have so far been operating with few legal or moral constraints. It does this in two important ways. First, the ruling is a determination by a respected international court that fracking and climate change constitute massive violations of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And second, the rights-based narrative reveals that fracking and climate change are grave issues of environmental justice. The human rights story could start anywhere in the world, but let's start in the Bakken oil fields, of North Dakota. Oil is dirty business. In the Bakken, spills, pipeline breaks, and well blowouts are frequent. According to the New York Times, between 2006 and 2014, an estimated 18.4 million gallons of oil and chemicals were spilled, leaked, or misted into the air, soil, and waters of North Dakota. Since 2014, a study of incident reports shows that spills, large and small, continue to happen at a rate of 1 every 1.7 days. And all of this in a rural region where most people depend on well water, groundwater. If you drive through the Bakken, you will see flares coming out of the ground beside the pump jacks, emitting fumes that deliver payloads of CO2 into the atmosphere, along with sulfur dioxide and other carcinogens.
Communities of color and low-income communities are more likely to live near multiple sources of greenhouse gases and other pollutants. They often call these pollution-burdened communities sacrifice zones because the communities that are host to coal plants, oil refineries, and more, we sacrifice the health, the well-being, and often the very lives of our residents so that the nation can waste 80% of the energy it generates.
We knew, we couldn't say, we didn't know, except what's certain. Benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene, volatile organic compounds, and diesel fuel, around 1% per gallon used in the Bakken shale, plus the radium inert in the rocks brought back up in the fracking fluid after it's made its long journey below to gather the oil and then brought topside to be separated out and shipped to wastewater centers where it's treated, cleaned, in condensate tanks, some of them lined, some unlined, seeping into the ground, toxins evaporating into the air. What's left over, uncleanable, trucked in water tankers to be disposed of, re-injected into the land previously known as away. Beyond groundwater contamination, now earthquakes in Colorado, Arkansas, the swath of states between Alabama and Montana, a 6-fold increase over 20th century levels, at least a dozen quakes last year in northern Ohio, one measuring up to 4.8 on the Richter scale. Speculation about the 30,000 disposal sites around the country where fracking wastewater is deposited, re-injected for final disposal into a deeper layer known as the basement rock. The speculation about fracking itself, deep underground explosions to extract oil, the water causing shifting plates, lubricating faults. Look for damage to homes. Look for reports of contaminated drinking water. Look for increases in breast cancer, miscarriages, birth defects. We knew, we couldn't say, we didn't know. Ground zero.
These facts alone, along with emerging evidence revealing that fracking sites and associated fracking infrastructure are disproportionately sited in non-white, low-income indigenous communities, both in the United States and in countries like Argentina, Mexico, and Canada, where fracking has been exported, means that it is right and necessary to understand the potential for human exposures and accompanying adverse impacts, not only as an issue of public health, but fundamentally as an issue of human rights.
Now, it isn't only activists calling out these human rights abuses. For the first time in history, an international human rights court has ruled that fracking and climate change systematically violate human rights. The Rome-based Permanent Peoples Tribunal's special session on human rights, fracking, and climate change has established the link between environmental destruction and human rights violations. Here are 4 of their central findings. First, the tribunal ruled that fracking and climate change create serious and catastrophic violations of human rights that are inherent in the industry. Here are the words from the advisory opinion.
It is impossible for the fracking system to respect rights of humans or non-humans, including those of land and water, as well as that of humans to health, life, free expression, or a clean environment. The rights violations of fracking and climate change are connected in a vicious circle. Heavy investment in fracking infrastructure militates against innovation in renewable energy. The slowing of renewables development leads to increased dependence on fracking, and so on.
So, the tribunal ruled that fracking should be banned worldwide. Second, the tribunal addressed the inherent injustice of fracking practices.
The system of laws regulating fracking is underpinned, accompanied, and permeated by racism and colonialism. The frontiers that make fracked gas cheap are constituted in part by frontiers of injustice, dividing black and white, indigenous and non-indigenous, rural and privileged urban dweller.
Fracking is economically feasible only because it legally devalues the lifeways and history of the people displaced by fracking. Thus, fracking, in the court's judgment, could not be made non-racist or non-colonialist without incurring costs that the industry is just unable to tolerate. Third, the tribunal pointed to the industry's strategies for overriding the rights and objections of people in frontline communities.
For fracking to exist, strategies for cheating, undermining, and expropriating affected communities must be coordinated in a cost-effective way across large land areas. The technical requirements for mass ruthlessness across the fracking frontier create incentives for the development and maintenance of extensive institutions for control of thought and other action. The secrecy of operations is all that allows the deadly, large-scale experiments in poisoning humans and non-humans that the fracking industry is currently conducting in violation of the Nuremberg Code.
And fourth, rather than protecting the rights of their citizens from rights violations, governments actively join with extractive corporations to permit serious violations.
Governments and extractive industries are joined in an axis of betrayal, the tribunal wrote. Such violations committed by megacorporations, for the most part, are done either under what have become symbolic environmental laws that have been implemented to allow practices, or in violation of such laws, but with impunity from the state. Nation states have invariably been bought off by the extractivist industries in the name of ersatz development.
The tribunal's ruling is a global affirmation that when climate change and the extraction techniques that fuel it directly harm the rights of human beings to life, liberty, and security of person, then deeply and broadly accepted moral norms have been violated, including those encoded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For more about what the tribunal's opinion means, I spoke with the co-editors of Bearing Witness, the human rights case against fracking and climate change, a book that's based on the testimony and rulings from this tribunal. The editors are Tom Kerns, co-drafter of the Declaration on Human Rights and Climate Change, and Kathleen Dean Moore, author of Great Tide Rising, Toward Clarity and Moral Courage in a Time of Planetary Change. First, I asked Kathleen about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that the tribunal cited in its opinion.
70 years ago, the world saw that when human rights violations are legal under the laws of nations, as the atrocities were in Nazi Germany, you have to have some overriding international law to call governments to account. So the nations of the world came together and reached unanimous agreement about minimal standards of human decency. They encoded them in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. For the first time in human history, it called on states to protect everyone's rights to life, liberty, and security of person. This is extraordinary the closest the world has ever come to a global moral consensus about what is worthy of us as human beings. These are moral standards against which the world can measure the actions of governments.
I asked Tom to tell us a little about the Permanent Peoples Tribunal and how he got them to hold a special session that would measure fracking and climate change against these moral standards that Kathleen mentioned.
The Permanent Peoples Tribunal is a remarkable institution. It's politically and economically independent, which is exactly what you want in a human rights court. It was founded in 1979, about a decade after the Vietnam War Crimes Tribunals that had been organized by philosophers Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre. That tribunal inspired the formation of the Permanent Peoples Tribunal, an international human rights court now based in Rome. In its 40 plus years of existence, hearing 40-some human rights cases against governments, it has developed an impressive body of human rights jurisprudence recognized and respected all around the world. Starting in 2014, and for the rest of that year, Anna Grear and Anna is the founder of the Global Network for the Study of Human Rights and the Environment, along with Damien Short, who's the director of the Human Rights Consortium at the University of London, began petitioning the Permanent Peoples Tribunal to take on this case. That process, back and forth, took over a year and was finally approved in the spring of 2015.
As Tom explained, this International Human Rights Court has a long history of hearing human rights cases and is well respected around the world. But an international court has no power to compel action. So I asked Tom and Kathleen what difference the ruling could make.
It is true that a civil society court like the Permanent Peoples Tribunal has no enforcement powers. The United Nations International Court of Justice also does not have enforcement powers. Public truth-telling really does matter. Giving public voice to wrongs matters. Speaking for those who have no voice matters. And the function of a tribunal is to do just that. Gandhi called it satyagraha, or truth force. It's the power of truth-telling and truth-showing to move, awaken, and compel so that, as Pope Francis says, the world can hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. So the judge's advisory opinion makes clear that it is courts like these that help develop the critical moral and legal standards referred to in the literature as soft law. And it's soft law that helps judges in national courts to better understand and interpret and apply the harder statutes of domestic law.
This tribunal didn't mince words. It listened to the stories of the witnesses and then told the big truth that has been distorted and hidden behind lies. Which truth? This one. It makes no sense to allow an industry that is unnecessary, known not to be sustainable for the long term, and inherently abusive of human and nature's rights to continue operating, especially its irrational and potentially catastrophic when we consider its inevitable contribution to climate change and water scarcity at a time when there is an urgent necessity to adopt policies that will save the planet. That's a direct quote from the advisory opinion. So what has long been considered normal corporate behavior is suddenly revealed as profoundly abnormal, irrational, and unjust. This dramatically undercuts the social license of the oil and gas industry to run roughshod over people's rights knowingly, intentionally, and systematically violated.
Let's single out a couple rights and dive into the details here. What rights in particular do fracking and climate change violate, and how? We'll focus on the right to health, the right to clean water, the rights of Indigenous peoples, and the right to be informed and to participate. For each of these, we turn to legal reporting on the tribunal, including direct quotes from the advisory opinion written by the panel of judges and to eyewitness accounts from the hearing.
Article 25 of the Universal Declaration, the right to a standard of living adequate to the health and well-being of themselves and their families.
I think we were going to stop right here, weren't we, Tom? If you could send us back. Thank you.
Okay, we're back.
Yeah, from that point on, it's focused on those individual rights that Carly mentions.
So we thought what we would do now is turn this over to Anna to lead us in a discussion. I think it's probably a craziness that she's going to be the one who asks the questions, with the presumption that we would answer them, when in fact she's the person who knows more about this than any of us. So I hope, Anna, that you will simply engage us with some of the questions that are on your mind.
I'll do my best. I'm no detailed lawyer. Anyone who knows me knows I'm a hopeless theorist. So the first question I want to ask, because I find this really intriguing, is I kind of wish I'd been a fly on the wall at your first conversation, you two, about the book. So I think it would be really lovely if you would share with us that first conversation, like what sparked between you that led you to want to produce this particular book in response to the tribunal. And what are your hopes for the book in terms of its potential impact, both for intimately affected communities and for those who are inevitably affected, but perhaps less intimately so?
I'll take the first part of that, Kathy.
Okay, I'll take the second.
Well, this was exciting for me. It was, I think, the last day or the second to last day of the tribunal, and Kathy and I and her husband Frank were sitting at their dining room table having a lunch. And so the tribunal was about to come to an end. And Kathy, as we're cleaning off the table, Kathy says, "Do you know of anyone who's planning to write a book about this?" "No, I don't know of anybody." And she says, "Well, what about if you and I do this?" And I must say, I mean, that really took me back. It was a huge honor to be asked by her, and a privilege to work with Kathy. If those of you in the legal world, if you're not familiar with her writings, you need to become aware of them, because she's a prolific and much awarded and much loved author. And so it was a real privilege for me to work with her on this. And it was exciting. We talked then for a half an hour and figured out basic details, and then went our ways. Got together in a couple months.
So what were your hopes, Kathy?
I don't know anybody, honestly, who writes a book who doesn't hope that it will change the world. That just seems to be a fact about writers. We thought that what the judges had to say was world-changing. We thought that it was powerful, important, and morally necessary to get those words out. They gave voice to some of the most important aspects, what people are saying down who live next to the fracking fields, and what people are saying when their water starts to burble and spark, and what people are saying when these big fracking rigs show up on their front porch. They're saying, often in tears, the kind of things that were affirmed by those judges. So the possibility of giving them voice, raising the voices, Pope Francis called them the silent voices screaming up to heaven. The possibility of putting those on the page and getting them in people's hands, we thought was an obligation. And the possibility of providing tools for people who are in a far better position than we philosophers are to make these arguments to the world, that we thought was overwhelming.
That's absolutely superb. So how then did you go about selecting the specific voices that you chose?
Well, that was that was a huge problem because we had just an enormous treasure trove of testimony and arguments and amicus briefs and judgments. And I mean, we finally, one of the problems was finding someone who would transcribe all that for us. And after we found someone, it turned out to be 2 or 3 reams of paper. And so organizing the book was a challenge. And so what we tried different structures for it, but what we ended up with was Don Anton in Australia had helped us write the 4 questions we wanted the judges to answer in their advisory opinion. And they're beautifully laid out. You can see them in the book and on the website. And but what they basically come down to is, does fracking violate human rights? Does climate change violate human rights? Do either of those violate rights of nature? And if so, what should be done about it? And so we organized the book around those 4 questions. The first chapter is what's fracking? How does fracking violate human rights standards? And we picked 3 or 4 specific rights. And then the second chapter is, does climate change violate human rights? And we picked 3 or 4 rights to focus on and gave testimony and arguments for each, edited in testimony and arguments for each one. And then the third chapter is how those violate rights of nature. And the 4th chapter is remedies that the judges suggested. And then there's a chapter that includes the advisory opinion and our final chapter on a coda and how to witness, how to bear witness for these things. And then we've got an appendix that's the reprinting of the GNHRE's Declaration on Human Rights and Climate Change, and an appendix listing all the 10 judges and their affiliations. So that's the structure that we came up with at the end, but that doesn't explain how we went about choosing the mass of testimony.
We felt that we were working as curators, that we were the custodians of this huge mass of really important information, which is, I should point out, available on a website, all of it, all of the testimony, all of the amicus briefs, all of the judges' opinions are available on the website that's called Tribunal on Fracking. So what we had was the opportunity to just bring out to the public the way a museum does, just put some things on the wall. And in my view, what we were looking for were the most powerful, the most impactful, the most heart-wrenching in many cases, the most convincing arguments that we could find.
Fantastic. Now I can see some questions coming in the chat. One here, which I think is a very good question. What makes fracking different from other extractive industries in terms of its racist and colonial impacts?
Nothing, as far as I can see. I mean, the tribunal used the term unconventional oil and gas extraction, which would include fracking and many other travesties. I don't like acronyms. So we ended up with fracking, and we also got most of our testimony from the United States where the fracking was taking place. So that turned out to be our emphasis. But we are really talking about unconventional oil and gas extraction in all its transmogrifications.
Yeah.
Is that so very different from traditional extractive industries in terms of its land grabbing, appropriative colonial violence?
It is an extreme version of those actual, yeah. Yeah. And Australia is another continent, another country that's having serious issues with they have different words for it, but it's basically the same process of exploding basement rock and harvesting, they call it, gas and oil that's stored in shale. A huge expense to water, of course. The amount of water that goes over, how did Sandra describe this? The amount of water that goes over Niagara Falls in a day, that's a lot of water, is used, that's a lot of fresh water, is used by the fracking industry in a year.
Wow.
So,
a question from...
Go ahead.
I was going to say, there's a question here from Maura. How has the tribunal's ruling been received in different countries? The people of the USA clearly haven't heard much about it. Are there any media in any countries that have done any good stories? Have you guys been following that?
We have.
Kathy?
Well, I was going to say, we really ask for help. We really need help to get these stories out, and particularly in other countries, but in this one as well, in the United States as well. We would love for people to send these stories around the world. We're not good at that, and we acknowledge that right off the bat. Putting together the tribunal was a feat of genius on the part of you and Tom. We don't have any of those geniuses in our shop as far as getting it out in the world.
We have one right down here in Mora. That's one of Mora's strengths.
She's shaking her head, Tom.
Yeah.
A little overextended.
There was a story on the front page of one of the newspapers in Scotland within I don't know, a couple of weeks after the tribunal ended, and that was fostered by one of the attorneys who argued with Michelle Maloney. Michelle is in Australia, and Lisa Mead is an attorney in Scotland. And they presented the rights of nature case at the tribunal. So they were able to get a front page story, but that's again, not our gift.
I think we had another question in the chat as well, from Eleanor Fraser. Do you think the human rights case has more potential to fight extractive industries than the environmental case?
Well, I'll start with just one word. Yes, because oil and gas, I mean, that big-footed guy was right that oil and gas has an enormous amount of power. And we've been hating oil and gas for, I don't know, decades at least. But we haven't been going after governments much. And one of the appeals for me of the human rights approach, I mean, besides that it's global and moral and legal and all that, is that it focuses on governments that clearly do have human rights obligations and that don't have the same kind of have different kinds of resistance ability than industry does, and kind of have to listen to their people. So I think the human rights approach has that virtue, and that it's global. It applies to everybody. Everybody can, when activists might say that that fracking rig is 7 feet too close to this person's back porch, and the uprising about that. People aren't really angry about 7 feet closer. What they're angry about is the moral horror of it. And one of the things that human right does is bring moral horror into the foreground.
Yeah, people say, oh, ethics, schmethics. When has moral principle, or when has the affirmation of a moral principle ever changed history? Well, those people aren't looking at their history very carefully, because many, many times When the people came together to assert a moral principle, history turned on a dime. The examples are thrilling. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and those monarchies, the European monarchies, fell like dominoes. Or if slavery isn't immoral, then nothing is. Abraham Lincoln and the nation went to war, freed eventually, imperfectly, 20,000 African-American people. There's real power in moral conviction. It is sorry about the phrase, but it is a trump card. If you say, but I can make $100,000 with this, the answer, but that's wrong, ends the discussion.
Can I just come back to you on that, Kathleen? Because I think the really significant thing you said there was when people come together to. Because for me, as a critical human rights lawyer, I can see the way in which human rights are also appropriated and evacuated of their moral meaning all the time in various legalized forms, and the way in which also environmental laws very often just mediate environmental injustice and legitimate it. But what it seems to me that the tribunal is a people's tribunal. It's a form of activism. It's a form of legal activism, analogous to, in some ways, the climate activism we're seeing in, large numbers of litigant-driven appeals to courts to actually get involved with the questions of climate justice. My sense of this is that, yes, moral outrage is significant, but it has to be expressed through a kind of politics of swarming, and it has to be expressed through forms of activism and acts of imagination, reaching beyond this existing system of rights, beyond the existing system of law, to the rights we don't yet have fully given to us, to rights we can imagine in alternative ways. And for me, one of the really exciting things about this tribunal was its blended jurisprudence between human and natural rights. Both categories have their problems, but there was something there about human, non-human connection, which would be very dear to certain communities on the earth, even if not to, mainstream Western human rights thinking. But again, the key in what you've just said, I think, is when people come together there has to be this swarming energy of outrage, a swarming set of acts of imagination. Which leads me to another question, if I might, drawing on Maura's question here. Could Tom please talk a bit more about what grew out of the tribunal in the form of the youth climate courts, Tom? Because I see that as another form of potential activism.
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. One of the remedies that the tribunal recommended was that this tribunal can serve as a model for people in local situations. They can bring their own tribunal around to some local situation. And so one version of that is young people coming together and deciding to put their local government on trial for its failure to live up to its human rights obligations. And I think that's going to have the power, going to bring the power of human rights standards to kids in local situations, applying pressure to their government. So there's a website now and a book called Youth Climate Courts.
Superb. It's a wonderful initiative. There's a question here from the Coalition to Protect New York. Do any of you think that we can win this fight as long as capitalism is the dominant socio-political economic system?
One of the things that makes this fight so hard is the way all the causal factors are tangled up together. We've got capitalism and colonialism completely at the base of extractive industry. We've got racism and cruelty to indigenous people right there at the heart. At the heart, that's a terrible word. What's another word? At the foundation of the fossil fuel industry. There's so many different factors, and for a while, there was this thought that we have to do one thing before we can do another. The big insight, I think, is that by doing one thing, we can act on the other. And it's not an either or thing at all. But if we can somehow weaken, or maybe we can transform, or maybe we can find better ways to be capitalists. I don't know if that's possible. Then by doing that, we are increasing the health of people. And by increasing people's health, then we're increasing the economy. I mean, these whole things are all linked together. So when you see two pictures, you see a starving polar bear on the one hand, and you see a picture of a Syrian toddler drowned on the beach. You're not going to say, which of these do I care about? Do I care about nature, or do I care about children? They're the same problem, and they have the same roots. So whatever is done at any point in that process helps tear down the whole edifice.
Yeah, underscoring that not one thing, it's not going to be one thing alone that's going to solve the problem, or that only one thing is at the root of the problem. It's a bunch of things are at the root of the problem. I remember Sandra Steingraber's suggestion that the way she put it into a metaphor was that it's time to play the Save the World Symphony now, and everybody has their own instrument and has their own place in the score, and so your job is to find your instrument and play your piece. You don't have to play the whole piece of music, but you have to play your piece. But then Kathy did an even better job than that, I thought. She said, well, except we don't have a conductor. We don't have anybody telling us what the next, how to do this. The score isn't already written. I mean, we've got a brand new, unique situation here. So what we're really having to do is improvisational jazz. Each of us have to come up with our own contribution to this growing, still developing ways to approach this crisis. So, and I think the virtue of that approach is that each one of us might have a particular focus, and that particular focus can go after that one root cause. And that's a great approach, because there's going to be other people going after the other root causes. I like the improvisational jazz metaphor.
Yeah, it's very good. Maura, I'm going to answer your question very directly. I don't think that we can achieve these things with capitalism as the dominant system, particularly not in its advanced neoliberal formation. It's extremely predatory. I think it was Achille Mbembe who termed the phrase necropolitics, and I think Banerjee applies that to capitalism in the form of necro-capitalism. I mean, I think we are looking at an order of highly practiced, extremely uneven, utterly unjust distributions of life, death, of predation and privilege. And until that system is undone and replaced, I think it's very difficult to push back. It has a wonderful way of reinventing itself in the language of its critiques. So if you think about green capitalism, for example, it mutates effortlessly to undermine, if you like, the critiques set up against it. Encouragingly, there are fantastic alternatives out there. The way I read it is that we've got a situation where we have a particular system in control, a particular system in power, and then underneath, at grassroots level, all sorts of imaginative alternatives, experiments with commoning and other dynamic modes of distribution of resources and engagement with different questions of reimagining what it means to even be human in a context, which is a fundamental task. We absolutely have to reimagine what it means to be human and stop being exceptionalist and start really understanding that we are interwoven and embedded material, vulnerable entities in a whole world of such entities, and to make our law and politics shift into that understanding. And that's where some of these litigation efforts and the tribunal, I think, hold out hope, because they're starting to chip away at some of those old assumed dichotomies between, liberal, masculine, disembodied rationality that undergirds law and the way in which these uneven forms of material predation actually land on bodies of all kinds, and distributed in all sorts of different situations and in highly uneven ways. And that's one of the things that really excited me about the tribunal, was the way they drew attention to the colonial racist formations at the heart of the industry, and the way that they actually saw a kind of axis of betrayal and put it in those terms. And by bringing in rights of nature, limited as they are as a conception, they also started to broaden the ontological basis of how we can work with human rights. And I think those are early, exciting signs. But yeah, no, I think there's no way we can do this if we continue to accept the strictures, power structures, and sociopathy of advanced neoliberal capitalism.
I'd like to follow up on that with you, Anna, if you don't mind. Philosophers think in terms of systems of value judgments, like deontological rights and duty-based systems, and risk-benefit systems, teleological and systems. And one of the virtues that I like about rights-based systems, especially that blended jurisprudence that the judges referred to, is that it kind of sidesteps the whole risk-benefit way of thinking about things. And I think that's a huge advantage. We've gotten stuck in the risk-benefit way of assessing things. And one of the virtues of the rights-based approaches is that they set that aside and supersede, take precedence over risk-benefit approaches. What do you think? Do you see that too as a benefit of rights-based approaches?
Yes, I do. I have very mixed feelings about rights-based approaches, because I think sometimes they assume a particular kind of subject and a particular set of subject-object relations. Right. And I think that we really have to question the deployment and structure of that subject. That said, I think we can imagine rights as contingent identifications of relations of injustice and justice from the point of view of the beneficiary of the relationship, and bring them into a much more mobile and thoughtful relationship with questions of obligation. And I think that's something that needs thinking through. I think also we have to question the nature of obligation, though, too, because that can become oppressive as well. I mean, the language that lives with me constantly is Donna Haraway's figuration, staying with the trouble. You know, rights are part of a larger conversation in which we, as human beings, as earthlings, are trying to stay with the trouble that we and our non-human kin are so desperately located in. And that these things are all just threads in a conversation, and they're all limited ways of thinking and acting and being, which remain contestable and remain open to a kind of pressing forward in a form of ethical braille. And I think that's kind of what we need to do. We are in the mess, we have to stay with the trouble, and we have to somehow negotiate our way through it in ways that are as respectful and inclusive and imaginative as is possible for us at this point in our history and our evolution. And I question my own use of the word "our" there, because it's a false totalization. There are multiplicities of human positions and different understandings of all these things. So yeah, broadly, but I think I still have a lot of question marks around the deployment of human rights. To me, they're at their most vigorous when they are exactly where Kathleen spoke about, the revolutionary, the people coming together, the resistance to injustice, their naming of oppression. That's where rights really come into their own as highly potent tools. When they're tamed, when they're legalized, when they're brought into the mainstream system, domesticated by the same ontology as underpins capitalist predation, they're not so useful at all. Dina,
may I add 2 sentences to the discussion, which Anna, that's beautifully said and so true and so important. Let me just say, as somebody who talks a lot with activists who are paralyzed, that this phrase, "we can't do anything until we do X," paralyzes people. And then we absolutely have to replace that with that we have to do everything, even as we X. That's all.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. Dina.
I mean, first of all, this has just been such a fascinating conversation. I'm really glad we're recording this, because I keep wanting to sort of go back and revisit, and just thank you so much. I guess, I mean, So my engagement with fracking comes from South Africa. I was working as a public interest lawyer there. We were kind of part of the movement, sort of trying to engage with and resist and bring in a moratorium into effect in South Africa. And one of the things that strikes me about that context is just the extent to which, and it's not only true for fracking, it's true for kind of all of the sort of extractive and development industries, the extent to which these industries they're not only kind of an expression of sort of harmful capitalism, they're also doing the job of the social state. You know, they're also, to the extent that roads are being built and services are being rolled out and schools are being established and clinics are being run, these things are being done in kind of to an extraordinary and alarming extent by extractive industries, by companies. You know, like one of the things we know is that Anglo American was rolling out ARVs to HIV positive employees long before the South African government was willing to recognize HIV as a pandemic in the country. The population was was dying out, but they're also kind of very intertwined in the kind of realization of rights in various ways. So there is this whole discourse about jobs being necessary for dignity, but it also goes kind of far beyond that. You know, there's kind of hugely complex rights relationships that these entities are involved in very intimate ways with the communities who they are very directly violating in other ways. And it's also a context in which the state is, you know, this sort of complex back and forth entity that is both, you know, there aren't these simple positions. There isn't a simple state. You know, there are parts of the state who are resisting and parts that weren't. It felt like a hugely complex world to think about the kind of entanglements of approaches and where one ought to locate oneself. And for the communities who are sort of having their water dried out by the fracking industry, or were losing their farming land, or were kind of getting these terrible, very temporary jobs in on fracking sites. This all also just feels incredibly entangled. There isn't some clean relationship of who is the oppressor in this situation, if you know what I mean. And I wonder whether that, because the judgment sounds kind of remarkable, sounds really wonderful, but I wonder whether there's anything in there to sort of deal with that complexity that locates sort of extractive industry in these enormously complex, intimate roles with rights and dignity and oppression with affected communities.
There is thank you. That is eye-opening and very, very disturbing. I would love to hear you talk about what you do about that, or do in that context. The only thing I can think of in the testimony that came out in the book is an activist who was from Oregon who said that what the fossil fuel industry does is offer us radioactive carrots. They have all kinds of sticks operating, but they also have these carrots, but those carrots are radioactive. So they'll offer a community a library or a police dog or a new fire engine. And everybody says, yay, aren't they really wonderful? Even as they poison their water forever. I don't know what to do. Do you? I mean, do you have some thoughts?
I mean, yes, but I don't, you know, I don't know. I don't have many very kind of clear, articulate thoughts that high. but I mean, I think it's, I mean, I think something that was important from my point of view, working in civil society as I was then, as opposed to sort of academia now, was just to be kind of much more it felt hard to know the enemy in many ways when one's sort of obligations were to sort of creating or to sort of trying to provide sort of dignified, meaningful lives for the communities who we sort of aligned with and worked with and thought ourselves to be fighting for. It felt very hard to sort of know where to locate that fight and how much of it to bring to the state and how much of it to bring to industry and how much of it to locate in sort of human rights language and how much of it to just talk about sort of the very basic bare necessities. And I, you know, part of our solution was to try and do bits of all of that. But yeah, I mean, I don't know.
Especially in the context of people who are desperate, for whom a new fire engine or a new well or a new library is really essential, or a job is just absolutely essential.
This is kind of part of what the problem is, though, isn't it? Is that the kind of generic control of the whole system itself means that it's very difficult to fight back in clear ways, because yes, you want to fight the ideology very strongly, but as you rightly say, Dina, there are multiple players moving with multiple different motivations and self-understandings, and it becomes complex. But I'm reminded of the work of Upendra Baxi, who makes the point that these kind of human rights have become a kind of conditionality imposed on certain nations to pave the way for neoliberal prioritization and market capture. And it seems to me that it's part of that larger globalized context in which these complexities that you're speaking of emerge, because there is an extensive level of ideological and market capture. And yes, you want the carrots, but the carrots are radioactive. But if you need the carrots, you're going to put your hand out for the carrots. What do you do? And it comes back to this question of, can we move things forward for as long as the dominant system remains in place? It is extremely difficult and extremely complex to move things forward. Nevertheless, as Kathleen said, you keep pushing, we stay with the trouble, we keep pushing, we try imaginative strategies wherever we can. We try also alternatives, which, you know, as I said, are blossoming all over the planet. And one can only hope that they get their moment to actually emerge into full view rather than being systematically suppressed by the existing system and its machinery. Well, that was cheery, wasn't it?
There's not much cheery about this story.
No. So we find some little chink that we can work in. You know, we find some little pebble that we can gnaw away at and try to make some little bitty bit of difference.
Oh, I think returning to the tribunal, that was an act of imagination. That was a little, more than a little chink. It's a kind of legality from below. I think that's how the tribunal itself describes its own mission, right? The creation of this legality from below, this rising up from the grassroots of people's voices raised against unethical, predatory practices with governments and corporations. So I think that's, you know, it comes full circle then to the tribunal and that glorious judgment, that outrageous, passionate, beautiful judgment.
One of the things that really moved me in this was such regular people coming in from the countryside to stand in and shake and be nervous in front of a microphone to tell their story. It's just, you know, really moving to me. And then to discover that later, after they left that and someone else came to the microphone, that person would go out into the hallway and just sob and sob and sob because someone listened to me. Someone heard my story. Someone who understands heard it and didn't try to sidestep it or didn't try to explain it away, but heard it. I think that's one of the most powerful gifts that a tribunal like this can give to the world.
Yeah, absolutely.
I also think that something that's come out really kind of strongly from talks today is that this wasn't just a piece of litigation; it was a piece of resistance, and it was about taking the tools that they were and turning them into tools of resistance, really kind of manifesting this tribunal into a kind of liberatory act, in a way, an act of self-expression, as you say, Tom, an act of speaking and being heard. And I think that's, I think that's part of a movement of resistance that's happening at the moment that is changing the world. And I think when we see kind of climate litigation and this litigation as part of that movement of resistance, as part of the kind of toolkit of rising up and speaking back and being heard in ways that haven't been just made available to us. I for one find that very kind of moving and inspiring, and hope. And as a sworn pessimist, I find it sort of fills me with a lot of sort of hope, and so I think this has been a very kind of optimistic book launch. Even as we sort of look at very closely the dark and horrifying side of what it is we're resisting.
A couple of my siblings, when I get ranting on this stuff, say, "Oh, Tom's bringing up another insoluble problem."
Not funny, Tom.
No.
One of the things that I think is interesting and maybe hopeful is the way the public discourse is in some ways changing towards a moral discourse. We find that, Greta Thunberg, for example, speaks very moral discourse when she says shame, or when she says, I hope you didn't know, because if you did know and you didn't act, I would have to call you evil, where she's naming the evil. The Pope Francis is doing the same sort of thing, where he's talking about our obligations to creation and the sacrilege of extractive mining and climate change. So every time I hear someone putting this discourse into something other than science, I cheer. And when I hear John Kerry say, follow the science, I think, yes, and follow the money and follow your conscience. There's so much more to be said than parts per million.
Just as a quick aside, I know this is being recorded, but I hope that means the chat is being recorded too. I haven't been able to look over it, but I really hope we get to save that.
Try. I wonder, because we're sort of coming to the end of our time, this has been a really sort of fantastic conversation, and I'm reluctant to end it in many ways, but I wonder if there are any kind of last comments or thoughts that any of the three of you would like to make before we close up.
Kathy's going to have the more eloquent of these, so I'm just going to mention one thing. Is that Orion Magazine asked Kathy to put together a series of 4 or 5 articles to be published over the next week and a half or 2 weeks in conjunction with COP26. And they're going to be in the online version of Orion Magazine. And I'd encourage folks to, and they're based on exactly this conversation.
My last words are words of gratitude for the brilliance that is assembled in this room, for the chance to hear you talk about this work as the work of resistance. That thrills me, that inspires me, and the ways in which you are digging deep into this, it gives me hope. So to all the people who came today, and to you who spoke today, I have the deepest gratitude and confidence that this conversation will continue in ways that may crank the wheel. So thank you so much.
Amen.
I just want to say thank you to both of you for the book and your incredible energy in bringing it together. It's an amazing contribution to put people's voices out there in the way that you have in this book. I think it's going to be very exciting for that book to land in various people's hands. And just to kind of reiterate this sense that we're all called to stay with the trouble, and that what we've done here, what we've been talking about, I think is part of the kind of politics of swarming that William Connolly so richly writes about in his work. And more power to everyone who's up for it, I say.
Thank you so much. Thank you for those last comments. Thank you, Tom and Kathleen, for this fantastic book, an amazing film. It's been so fascinating. We've put a link to the film in the chat for those of you who want to watch it. There's also a link to the book so that you can read more about it. Thank you so much to Anna for being our fantastic discussant, for making this just a really vibrant, interesting conversation. We will be putting the recording on the GNHRE website shortly. I know lots of people in time zones for whom this wasn't easy were asking us about the recording. So we'll let you know when that's up for you to share. And thank you again on behalf of the Global Network for Human Rights and the Environment. See you all again soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Bye.